Thank you so much for that introduction. It is true that I am very passionate about the children's portfolio, the children's policy area, and I have been asked in the past why that is, or why I've been assigned that particular portfolio. It is fair to say I am still the closest thing to a child in the Labour caucus. But I'll leave you to decipher the origin of the rest of my passion for this area. It's nice to be back in the Waikato as well. This is very close to where I grew up. I grew up in Morrinsville, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. But after a period of actually living in a very small town as a child, I started my education in a town called Murupara. Does anyone know where Murupara is? Oh, kia ora. It's nice to be in a place where they know where Murupara is. It's a very rare thing. I wasn't actually going to share anything about my short time in Murupara, but I think I will. Some people ask me why I got into politics, and particularly as early as the age of 17. To be honest, I was political well before that, but not in the traditional sense of the word. I was political in the sense that I noticed stuff. And I noticed when things felt unfair, even as a small person. And we moved to Murupara when I hadn't even started school. My dad was the local policeman. As you can imagine, that did not make me the most popular child in the schoolyard, but thankfully I was quite large for my age. But when I was living there, I remember distinctly noticing kids around me who didn't have shoes. That was the first thing I remember noticing. I'd come from Dinsdale. All the kids in Dinsdale had shoes. Kids in Murupara didn't have shoes, and it was cold. I noticed the kids that didn't have lunch every day at school. And I remember even talking to my mum and dad about these things. And that short period in that place, I think made me realise that New Zealand is not the fair and equal society we would like to think it is. It may be that great mantra of the greatest place in the world to bring up kids, but is it the greatest place in the world to be a child, if we were to turn that notion on its head? So I think that's probably some of those first memories are the reason that I'm political, because politics is a place where you can make change on those kinds of issues. It is a means to an end, sometimes a brutal means to an end, but one I think is still entirely worth enduring if you can do good things while you're there. You know, the last time I was at the Kingsgate Hotel, I'm just having a slight flashback, I used to job train people with intellectual disabilities, and one of the places I used to work was the Kingsgate, changing bedrooms and sheets and dirty rooms. Thankfully, the company is much finer today, and I'm very excited about the lineup that I saw here today, so I know there's a lot of experience in the room. But let me get straight into some of my new policy areas. You will have heard from the introduction, it's not in the program. In the program, I'm the former spokesperson for social development. I feel a little too old to have been retired out of something already. But I'm now a spokesperson for children, corrections, police, arts, culture and heritage. And when I first got given that group of portfolios, a journalist called me and said, it's a bit of a random collection. And I said, well, not really to me. In fact, corrections, if anything, will be my daily reminder of what happens when we don't get things right. In fact, I started realising that when I first got into Parliament. The very first portfolio I ever had was as the Youth Justice spokesperson for the party. I had Youth Justice and Youth Affairs. I remember when I first sat down in my meeting with Phil Goff who was our leader then. Stay with me, everyone. Labour's gone through a few changes, but we're now set home and hose for the election now. But back when Phil Goff was the leader, we sat down for a meeting and he said, I'd like to give you Youth Affairs. And I said, that's great, but please can I also have Youth Justice? It wasn't a separate portfolio then, but it was the one area of the justice system that I felt like the New Zealand public was still willing to give us a shot to turn a young person's life around. Was still willing to really bed in notions of restorative justice and early intervention and make a go of not writing off a young person for a mistake that they had made. And I remember when I was in that role, listening to Andrew Beecroft. I'm sure many of you in this room will be familiar with his work, talking about the fact that if you had a group of youth offenders in a room, you could probably determine 5 things that would be common to almost all of them, and you could probably list them now. They were family and gang-related violence, drugs and alcohol abuse. In fact, 80% of the young people that came before him in the youth court had committed their offence whilst under the influence of alcohol or drugs. It's not that dissimilar for the adult court, of course, as well. Disengagement with education and learning difficulties. You can still hear me, can't you? Yeah. Disengagement with education and learning difficulties, and also lack of engagement in any form of employment. Those are, if you will, some predictors when you're just looking at the youth justice area. And I remember thinking, well, you know, if these things are so obvious, surely then those are the things that we should be looking at when we're trying to find ways to intervene and stop young people from heading down that track. I remember feeling how stark that message was for me when I went on one of my first New Zealand-based prison visits. I'd been through prisons in the UK previously. And I visited, not too many years ago now, New Plymouth Prison before it closed. I don't know if anyone ever went through New Plymouth Prison. It is one of the most depressing prison facilities, probably I think that we've ever had on our books. It was an old military hospital. You know, these were small rooms where literally you have to duck to get into the room. They were made out of the very, very old blockwork. It was small, just big enough to have one bed, a toilet in the corner, which you would flip down a tray over to eat your meals off of essentially the top of the toilet. And as we were walking through the prison, I saw, it was a remand prison as well, and I saw a 17-year-old, I was told he was a 17-year-old boy, lying on a mattress. And as we got to the space where the corrections officers were, I could see this young man's room from the monitor. And I said to the corrections officer, "What does he do all day?" And he said, "Well, our staffing numbers are down, so we're in lockdown most of the time. He doesn't go out much, that means. So he just lies there." And I said, "Well, does he read?" He said, "Nah, that one doesn't read." And I said, "Well, what does he do?" He said, "Well, we break them with the boredom." He didn't say it with any satisfaction on his face. He almost said it knowing exactly what was happening in that period to that young man. But that is not unusual. You look at, just the prison muster in a place like Mount Eden. 50% of those prisoners, when they come into prison, are unemployed. We know, anecdotally, that a high number, through the course of their childhood, have had some interaction with child, youth and family as well. Just ask Carolyn Henwood, who's been doing her work with children who have been in state care and experienced some kind of abuse. She wants to go into prisons knowing that a high number of those young people are now in that place. And that's before you even get to some of the incredibly appalling statistics around Māori imprisonment. Kim Workman, to this day, shared the most staggering statistic I have ever heard, I think, in my time in politics. And as you'll know, we hear a lot of statistics, but this one stuck with me. When he shared at an event in 2011, that 40% of our 15-year-old plus Māori male population has been in prison or has served a community-based sentence. 40%. Now that absolutely staggers me. So when you put all of that together, what does that tell us? I think quite simply, T.S. Eliot sums it up nicely. In the beginning of this poem that he penned many moon ago, that says, "In my beginning is my end. In my beginning is my end." It says to me that so much about where we end up in life is predetermined, and staggeringly much earlier and earlier than any of us would like to think, particularly when you work in the area of policy interventions. But it's becoming increasingly obvious that you can predetermine what happens for a young person, not just from those preteen years, but actually going all the way back to their exposure to violence and abuse as a child, to the maternal health that they're exposed to. And it's something that Sir Peter Gluckman is talking about more and more, the fact that health, diet, obesity, all of this can then predetermine the health life path of the child a mother is carrying before you even get on to issues like fetal alcohol. It even determines your access to education, the one thing that in New Zealand we hold on to as being a universal that isn't predetermined by birth. But the biggest determinant of them all, if you were to pick one, the biggest determinant of them all still remains poverty. It's something that I think the conference was quite right to point out in the document that was shared before the conference with all the conference summaries. And it stated, "It is clear that child neglect and abuse are associated with poverty, and that despite ongoing research over 20 years, the true dimensions of child poverty and its relationship to child abuse in New Zealand are only now becoming the basis for comprehensive protection policies designed to address the plight of vulnerable children." I both agree and disagree with that statement. I absolutely agree with the sentiment that poverty must become the basis of the work that we do around vulnerability and child protection issues. I use vulnerability with many heavy caveats, but I'll come back to that. I disagree, though, that this approach is being integrated into our policy development currently. And that probably brings me to my point around where I perceive the fundamental difference between political parties at present in government around the issues that you're talking about here today. It ultimately, I think, comes down to whether or not a government or political party is willing to be broad in their approach or narrow in their approach. Narrow, if you were to adopt that kind of approach, is highly targeted. And as the Minister has said in her conference paper, she says the White Paper for Vulnerable Children released in October last year unapologetically targets resources and interventions and support to children who are currently being abused or seriously neglected and to those most at risk. A broad approach, in my mind, would instead accept, acknowledge and wish to address that 270,000 children in New Zealand are currently living in poverty. Now, of course, not all of those children will be at risk of abuse or neglect. Of course not. But if you focus instead of lifting the well-being of all of that group of children, then you of course get broader outcomes that lift an entire potential generation and not just those who we identify as being neglected and abused currently. If you will, if you broaden the net, you catch not only a wider range of children, but you have positive flow-on effects that go beyond just the narrow view of abuse. Now, you might say, well, that just sounds like common sense. Why wouldn't we do that? Well, every time we've talked about this debate in Parliament, the thing that gets thrown back from the debating chamber floor, and literally tit for tat, we'll stand up and say we should be broadening out this stuff to poverty. The national government members will stand up and say, argue vehemently, almost angrily, that not all children in poverty are abused. Of course they're not, of course. And to try and claim that to broaden out your approach is that you're labelling parents in poverty as bad parents is entirely mischievous and unfair. But if you're a child living in poverty, you're 5 times more likely to be hospitalised for injuries from assault and neglect. 5 times more likely. Just like if you're a child who has a parent in prison, you're 7 times more likely to end up in prison yourself. We seem more willing as a society to acknowledge the connection there than we are willing to acknowledge the other connection on the other side. We also seem more willing to acknowledge or accept a connection between social security and people on benefits and outcomes for children than we are willing to say that actually it's not about whether you're on a benefit or not, it's more whether or not you're living in a state of poverty. For me, it feels like there's a lot of politics to talking about the children of beneficiaries rather than talking about the children living in poverty. That's my slightly more controversial point. So I guess that's where we see there being a fundamental difference that I know, at least for the Labour Party, and certainly I can take from the rhetoric of parties like the Greens, that our key starting point is to use poverty not as the single key, but as one of the biggest ones, as the foundation for the policies we develop on child wellbeing. Because there is a much bigger prize at stake, much, much bigger. Yes, you will start at the same time to acknowledge issues of abuse and neglect, but you'll also start working on issues around the economic wellbeing of all your citizens. the ability to participate in your society. And we know from one of the last economic indicator reports that material deprivation had grown from 15 to 21% for our families. That basically means their ability to participate in things like school trips, to provide birthdays for their children, whether they can afford to have a computer in the home, things that are basic to participation. And it also means you can start addressing the issues of inequality, what has become, I think, a major and rightly so debate in the social development area. So those are the ideological differences as they stand. But I'm here more actually to bring you a message of hope. That this political difference that I've outlined doesn't mean, I don't believe, that we can't and shouldn't work together. In fact, it's imperative that as political parties in this space that we do work together. In fact, recently, anyone watch Parliament TV? So no insomniacs in the room? Oh, a couple of insomniacs. I always marvel when I meet people who enjoy watching Parliament TV. The most common screen is the one telling you when it's next going to be screened, unfortunately. But we were debating the vulnerable children's bill, the bill that Paula Bennett has most recently brought before Parliament. And I stood up by beginning my address in Parliament by thanking the Minister for bringing that bill to Parliament and the process that had led it to come there. There was this weird stunned silence, and then the Minister yelled something slightly abusive at me and normality resumed. But the reason I thanked her was because no matter where your starting point was on the Green Paper, it was an overwhelming response from the community and from the sector. And to be honest, we did start out being quite sceptical. We were quite critical in Labour. Annette King was the spokesperson at the time of the fact that we were going through this process again. We felt that the evidence already existed and it was more less hooey, more doey. But you cannot deny that the feeling, the sentiment that came through from the public was, and the sector, was the desire to have their voice heard in that discussion. So I accept that that's been a very positive thing. I read a number of the submission. I couldn't read all of them, there were just too many, thousands of them, but I read a number. And there were 3 key messages that came out really strongly for me. And I will be frank, I don't think all of these were picked up, particularly, some of them not at all, but we should still hang on to them, whether the government progresses them or not. The first strong message that came out for me was give children a voice in all of this, and take a child's rights perspective. The thing that I find really interesting when I go around and talk to community groups like Rotary and the like about some of the issues that you and the sector you work in, is that that's not a natural starting point for us in New Zealand. Probably nothing's more stark in that regard than the debate that happened over Section 59. You know, that debate came about the rights of parents with their children rather than the rights of a child. Leaving aside all of the many other things about that debate that were misconstrued and misinterpreted, that for me was quite a stunning reality that came out from it, and something that we have to work very hard to change our perspective as a country. The second issue that really stood out for me in those submissions was the need to broaden the definition of vulnerability. Some people hate the use of the word anyway, that all children are vulnerable. That's a valid argument. But that was the second issue, and that builds into our view on child well-being and poverty issues. And the third area was the desire the public had to see politicians work together. And that was extremely strong in some of the meetings that I went to as well. Why can't you guys just get it together? Because where is the politics in child protection? Who's going to argue with the need to look after children and ensure that they are safe? Now, that's something that we have fully taken on board, and without running through all of the nitty-gritty, we've made the offer to work with the Minister on child protection issues every year, and since the last election from memory, roughly every year. Now, I will accept it is easy to make that offer when you're in opposition. It really is. You know, you're the ones that are powerless sitting on the opposite side. You're not the ones doing the work. So I acknowledge that. It is a much easier offer for us to make than it is for a government to accept. But I still think that we need to fundamentally change the way we work on their issues. Now, there will be areas where we disagree, but ultimately what you as a sector need is continuity. Not every election cycle to present a new opportunity for a government to chuck everything out, rebrand it and start again. And that's why today I repeat the pledge I made in Parliament on that first reading to you, and that is we will continue the work of the Children's Action Plan. Too much has gone into that action plan to simply dump it and start again. Too much input has come from the sector for that to be the case. So that's a commitment I make on behalf of the Labour Party. There are two things, though, that we wanted to sit alongside that. We believe in evidence-based policy making, so we will continue to assess whether or not all of the interventions that are proposed in the action plan are working. You know, how well are the children's action teams working, for instance? The new helpline, you know, is that successful? Is the way that the Minister wants to change the way SIF's working, is that successful? We've already said there are two areas where we have some pre-existing concerns. I will be very open about the fact that we have never been fans of the risk predictor model in the way that it was first presented. We had grave ethical concerns about using benefit data to make presumptions about the likelihood of a child to be abused. I stand by the need for clinical assessment, using human beings to talk to another human being about their status and what's going on in their lives, and using information to back that up, but the risk predictor on its own is not something that we support. I do understand it's being altered somewhat. Some in this room may even be closer to that than me, but at the moment that's something we had some grave concerns over. And we've also already expressed our concerns about the child protection orders, but I'll come to those a little later in the piece. And as I said, we will always take a broader approach to child wellbeing, but that is in and above just the Children's Action Plan, which for me is actually about child protection. It's not about overall child wellbeing. So I want to cover briefly then in the next few minutes. First, some of the things that we would like to add on to what's already happening, then a few remarks on what's going through Parliament at the moment. And then I'd like to just move to some open questions, just because post-lunch speaker, try and keep everyone awake. So, what's different about what we're thinking about doing in this area? Well, it always sounds bureaucratic to say, let's start at the centre with the way that we organise government, but some of you will know that it absolutely makes a difference to the way that then things roll out at community level. That's not to say that we want a top-down approach, but it is to say that we want central government to take a much more child-focused approach to policy development. You'll have noticed that I'm the spokesperson for children. There is no shadow minister role in government. It is simply the Minister for Social Development. We think actually having a minister for children who is senior, who sits in cabinet and has their own ministry coordinating the activity across government will make a key fundamental difference to the way we think about children's issues. So that's what we're going to do. We also think that will help us with the key issue of accountability. Time to time I stumble across issues like homelessness, particularly amongst young people. Children in particular who exit SIF's care and fall into that gap where they actually are neither the responsibility currently of SIFs or of Housing New Zealand or of anyone. In fact, I've heard cases of young people being referred to women's refuge because there is simply nowhere else for them to go. Now, in those circumstances, you almost find yourself, and even working in government, I find that you end up chasing who has responsibility for some of these issues, who is accountable. We also, underpinning all of this work, currently we have a members' bill before Parliament in my name. It's called the Child Poverty Eradication and Reduction Bill. I must acknowledge, and Jonathan may not want me to do this, but I must acknowledge that this was not something that we worked on, that I just conjured up. An enormous amount of work was done through the Children's Commissioner's Expert Working Group on child poverty reduction, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with that work. One of the working papers specifically spoke to a need to legislate around some of these issues. And so it talked about having a bill, a law, that essentially requires government to focus on not only measuring issues around child poverty, using a range of measures, not just one simple one, setting targets to reduce it, and then having a plan that spans housing, education, social development, and health in order to make sure we start tackling some of the outcomes of poverty at all of those levels as well. Now, if we did that, we would be akin to the UK and Wales. I think the Wales uses a scorecard and the UK has an actual bill. We would be, I believe, world leaders in this area if we did that. And the great thing is that not only would it then publicly demonstrate to the country the progress that a government was making, it would mean that they would then have to report on it every budget. What a difference I think it would make if Bill English, every time a budget came around, didn't just have to talk about, our export deficit or, what was happening to GDP, but talked about the well-being of our children. I think it would fundamentally change the way that we work in between budgets and the focus that government policy takes. So that's another thing that we want to bring in when we're in government. The whole idea of measurement, though, I notice that whenever I talk about this with anyone in the sector, it kind of has this dual impact of making people bristle a little bit, and I can see why. Sometimes when we set targets at a government level, without talking to people who are working in the field, it can lead to some distortion in the way that everyone operates. I use rheumatic fever as an example. It's probably not the best one I can use because actually the government has started to change the way it's dealing with rheumatic fever quite a bit, and I really do congratulate them on that and everyone who works in that field. But originally the government brought in a rheumatic fever target around reducing incidents of rheumatic fever. And the way then that was responded to out in the field was to start swabbing children in schools to try and find incidents of strep A, which then was obviously a precursor to rheumatic fever, giving them the necessary drugs and then sending them home back to their overcrowded, damp, cold house, which we know is ultimately the cause of rheumatic fever. That was an example of where, we might have started bringing the numbers down, but if you had stopped that swabbing program, what would have happened overnight? We could have been in a dangerous situation. Now, though, I will acknowledge the government has started putting a bit of money into housing assessments, predominantly in Auckland, I believe, so that if you do show up with strep A, your housing situation is then assessed to make sure that we are looking at some of those contributing factors. But then what remedial action happens? What then are we doing about that cold, damp house? Well, if it's a Housing New Zealand house, you might then go onto the top of a waiting list to move into a warmer or a drier home. Or you might be one of the lucky houses that the government, as part of its warrant of fitness, then insulates. But 80% of kids in poverty aren't living in Housing New Zealand houses. What we need is every private rental in New Zealand to have a warrant of fitness, to be warm and dry. And as much as that is a controversial thing in the private housing sector, that is absolutely what we're committed to doing, because we've got to get back to the root cause of some of these issues. And it's not just rheumatic fever, it's respiratory diseases, it's infectious skin diseases. And when you go to places like Northern and hear nurses in schools tell you that they see children who look like old kauri trees because of the repeat incidents of skin infections, you see why we need quality housing and quality healthcare. Plus, just add to that the economic common sense of the fact that a couple of nights in hospital would actually pay for you to go and insulate that cold house that caused that child to be there in the first place. Now, all of that brings me to the second notion. So we're starting at the centre, but the other issue that we want to focus on is this idea of getting in early, the prevention rather than the intervention when things go wrong. You've heard us talk about this before. Everyone talks about it. We're just not very good at doing it. We talk about it in justice as well. But we have to acknowledge at some point that, we spent $1.2 billion on the justice sector. There will have to be a period where we start taking some of that spend and putting it over here. And the government that does it probably isn't going to reap the financial reward from that. But we will all reap the moral reward. It is the right thing to do. And regardless of whether or not it takes 3 years or 6 years or whether you're in to see it happen, It just needs to happen anyway. So some of the things that we want to do in the early prevention space is first acknowledging that actually income matters. You know, in the debate about lunches in school, we heard it all. The judgment that came firing out towards parents in New Zealand, I was almost overwhelmed by. My sentiment has always been this: withhold your judgment on parents until we can hand on heart say that parents have enough resources they need to do right by their kids. And we know, based on the stats we get and every bit of analysis we do by MSD, that that's currently not the case. So let's start asking the question, what can we do to make sure parents have all they need to do the job that ultimately is theirs, not the state's. The state is a miserable parent. But what can we do to enable those families to do the best they can? Again, another difference between where the government wants to go and us. We are interested in income issues. We do want the minimum wage to go up. We do believe and support the notion of a living wage. But we also have to acknowledge that our sole parents are the ones raising children in poverty currently. And if we stand by the notion that the best thing we can do by a young child is have their parent with them in those early years, should they by default live in poverty while they're doing it? That's a fundamental question that we need to ask when it comes to social security. And that's something that a little closer to the election we'll have more to say on. I want to speak to one more policy quickly that we want to bring in, and then I'll speak very, very quickly on the Vulnerable Children's Bill. My sister had a baby 5 weeks ago. It's been the most exciting thing for my family. First one in the family, taken a lot of pressure off me. And I remember when I called, my sister lives in London, which is a great sadness for me, but joyfully she's called the baby Isabella, which was a lucky escape, a beautiful name, given the child's father's name is Stingray, so I was quite worried about what this little girl might be called. But when I called my sister just after she had the baby, she uttered out these two kind of bits of feedback for me. She said, first, take the drugs. Second, she said, get mum. Mum stayed with my sister for the really critical period after my little niece was born. And when I managed to sneak in a quick visit to see my sister, and we were sitting in her lounge, and she'd been feeding 5 hours a day. She had palsy in one hand, she'd had 2 blood transfusions, she'd had all the things that mums have. And she said to me, how do people do this on their own? How do they do it on their own? And yet so many parents do it on their own. And I thought, as I naturally do, I always start thinking about policy when I hear things and have discussions like this. And I read the outcome a while ago of a pilot project in the Hawke's Bay, carried out by someone who had been given a Vodafone scholarship, spent a year working under Plunkett, doing a pilot on bringing Plunkett nurses into the homes of teen mums before baby was born. Same nurse. Particular nurse was chosen for her youth, for her relationship she was able to form with the girls. And she stayed with those young women for as long as they needed, for as many visits as they needed. So not your strict 7 visits. She came in pre-birth, and it had amazing outcomes. Breastfeeding was up, immunisation up, referrals into other agencies who were able to support these young women up. The thing that really stuck out to me was a story that was shared with me about one young woman who was in a violent relationship. And she had been working with this nurse for a time, and the nurse had talked to her about things like attachment and how to notice and read her baby. You know, things that you don't really necessarily just get taught. And this young mum relayed a while ago the story back to this nurse of how she had got in a fight with her partner. Her partner was very aggressive to her while she was holding the baby. And she, of course, thought, baby fine, too young to know what's going on. She noticed in the days after that the baby was really unsettled, didn't want to be left alone, cried if she ever put the baby down. And she recognised that that violent relationship was causing attachment issues for her baby, and she got out. Now, that little piece of powerful knowledge that was supplied to that young mum, because she didn't just have a nurse that visited, she had someone who was an expert who she trusted, who taught her how to read the signs of her own baby and how to then take that and use that in powerful decision-making for herself and the best needs of her child. That's why I want to take the key learnings of that and also nurse-family partnerships in the US. And we're going to start small, but we're going to start. We want WellChild to be the home of every vulnerable mum in New Zealand before birth. That's 18,000 parents a year, 7,000 extra visits that we want WellChild, that's Plunkett, Tamariki Order, whoever you think is going to work for you and your needs, into the home. We want it to be the same nurse, not a different nurse every time, because that relationship matters. And that for me is a perfect example of proportionate universalism, which is something I utterly believe in the health area. And it's a starting point. And it also says that rather than necessarily having SIFs rolling up to your door, but you use something that doesn't have stigma, that isn't about a deficit approach, but is about support. So, I've got other things that I wanted to talk about in the area, but I noticed that time is passing rapidly on, so I'm going to flick over. I had some things I wanted to say about SIFs that we want to do differently as well. Perhaps I'll touch on them very, very quickly. We do think it's time that we reviewed child, youth and family. I've been banging on about this for some time, but I do have concern, firstly, over the amount of the sheer pressure that precious workforce is under. 150,000 notifications, massive increases in what they're dealing with, but not an increase in staff. Every time I've talked to the Minister about this, both in Select Committee and in Parliament, she said, well, the difference is we don't want SIFs having to go in and triage all the time. Fair point, neither do we. We'd much rather they didn't have to take on some of those complex cases, but they exist. Her view is that we should get NGOs coming in and doing more of the differential response work. My issue with that is we've got to deal with the reality of what's here in the here and now, whilst we're trying and take that early intervention approach. NGOs are already dealing with very complex cases. The idea that SIFs are dealing with trivia doesn't wash with me. I don't think anything they deal with is trivia that can be simply carved off without putting significant resource into that sector. So ultimately, in my mind, whether you go to the community or whether you go to SIFs, it's the resource that's lacking that's the issue. And so I'd be interested as to what the Minister chooses to talk to you about on that front when she comes in. I do think we also need to take a fundamental look at the state of state care. It's the toughest of policy issues. The notion of removing a child from their family is a call that I doubt anyone would want to have to make, let alone having to make it on a near daily basis. But the question has to be asked, are we always making the right decision at the right time and giving stability to children as we do it? When anyone hears a story of a child that's had 14 foster carers and is only in their early teens, you know that we've set a child off onto a very negative trajectory. And I simply want to ask the question as to whether or not some of that is preventable. We also need to have a conversation, I think, about what we are doing for our foster carers. They do an incredibly difficult job under trying circumstances. And whilst Home for Life was aimed, I think, at giving them greater stability, they're not getting the support if they go into that role. Equally, some of them are taking Home for Life because they're told if they don't, they'll lose their kids. So that means that we've got people who are moving into a role with kids with very high needs and are now simply being abandoned in that job. And it's their love for those kids that keeps them going through that. But surely we can do better by them. And the final point, I'm pleased that the Minister has said she's going to extend the role of the state's responsibility for children who have exited SIFS care beyond the age of 17. That for me is critical. Ask any parent if at the time their child turns 17 whether or not they cut them off, move them out the door and have nothing to do with them again. And yet that's what the state does. It's not right. And now, that doesn't mean we keep all children in residential facilities till they're 20, but I do think it means that we take responsibility for them having a plan and then having a voice in that plan. These are young people that we've got to stop doing things to. But keep them in a conversation about what's going to best meet their needs. 90% of the young people that LifeWise in Auckland are dealing with are ex-SIFS children. They are an organisation that works with the homeless, not just the homeless, rough sleepers. And that's where our SIFS kids, many of them, are ending up. Now, I'm just aware that I had a sheet of things I was going to talk about the bill, but instead I'm just going to leave that and leave you to ask me the bits that you're interested in. And instead, I just want to finish by actually giving my thanks to you. We talk a lot. We are the ones that stand back and come up with ideas, and we're not always good ideas, mixed ideas often. Now, I certainly try and engage as much as I can with you, and in doing so, recognise that ultimately you're the ones doing all the work on the front line, many of you. So I thank you for that, and I hope that we will soon have an opportunity to work collaboratively with you to give greater stability to the sector, to do good things, but ultimately to make New Zealand the best place to just be a child. Thank you very much.